we have the representatives of 3 publishers on hand who are going to update you on some of the titles in their World Christianity publications. And then we will begin our second keynote. We'll segue after we hear from these 3 publishers, and they are Baylor, Brill, and Fortress. And we will begin with Baylor. So David Aycock and Joel Carpenter, please.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Thank you for the invitation to speak. This is a great conference, and it really hits a sweet spot for Baylor University Press. If you don't know us as a press, we are focused on theology, biblical studies, really religion, and fill in the blank. And we're looking for academic monographs all the time that fit those areas. We do have a really extraordinary series called the Studies in World Christianity series. We are about 12 or 15 books strong into that series now, with studies going into a number of different cultural backgrounds, histories, geographies. And our series editor, Joel Carpenter, is active in this group and is also with me today on the call. And so aside from providing you all with a discount on the books in that series, even beyond, I'm going to post a link to a flyer in the chat just now. Actually, I don't have the ability to send it, so maybe they'll can unlock that later. But we will send around a link to a discount code that gives 30% off plus free shipping on all Baylor University Press titles. And that code, if you want to write it down, is 17PTSEM, right? PTSEM 21, like 2021. So 17PTSEM 21. And I'm going to invite Joel Carpenter to tell you a little bit about the SWC Studies in World Christianity series. Thanks, Joel.
Yeah, thank you, David. I'm Joel Carpenter, and I'm a retired provost and professor from Calvin University. This series, Studies in World Christianity, is a partnership between the Nagel Institute for the Study of World Christianity and Baylor University Press. I'm just delighted on how it's gone. It fills an important niche, I think. You know, there's this Oxford series on world Christianity that does continent-wide and even worldwide thematic studies. There's the journal Studies in World Christianity that gets hot new topics and ideas going. But how about a monograph series for movements on the ground, the real points and coordinates of the tremendous religious change that's happening in our world? So that's what the series is there to publish. And we are looking for a couple of good books, a couple of outstanding authors a year. We're blessed this past year to have 3 titles come out, and please do take a look at the series flyer that David's providing. There's much more I would love to tell you about it. Contact me for sure if you have some interest or some questions.
Well, thank you, David and Joel. Next will be Brill, Tessel Junkier.
First of all, I wanted to invite you to the Brill booth, which is obviously not there. We'd have loved to have you in a proper booth, which could have looked something like this. But since that is not there, I'm happy to share some of our flagship products with you. The first one that I would like to share with you is the World Christian Encyclopedia Online. This is the online version. You can go to the next slide. This is the online version of the World Christian Encyclopedia 3rd edition, which is edited by Todd Johnson and Gina Zerlo. The print version is published by Edinburgh University Press. And we now have the online version, which you can see on the next slide. You can see what it looks like. This is the same article as you saw in the prints. There are some demographics and tables. There are graphs and maps, which you can see here. There are a lot of images. We also have extra images for the online version as compared to the print version. And there will be an author meets critic session with Gina tomorrow. So, well, Gina will be happy to present you both the print and the online version and tell you more about it. So please visit that. The next one that I wanted, oh, this is the URL where you can find more information. The next one that I want to present to you is the Encyclopedia of Global Pentecostalism, which is online, but also, next slide, in print. We expect the print version in, I hope, April or May. So that's already in production. This contains different topics, 42 important themes and topics in Pentecostalism. Also biographies of, well, what is it, 138 historical figures in Pentecostalism, ranging from the very early days to a few decades ago. There are movements and organizations, 60 of them. We hope to be as complete as possible, and development in 81 countries, but also a bigger focus on regions. So that is, here's the information you can get on the Encyclopedia of Global Pentecostalism. Then we also have a very nice series, which I also want to show to you, the Theology and Mission in World Christianity, which is edited by Kirsten Kim, Steve Beckens, and Mika Ruokanen. Here you see a couple of the latest volumes, and on the next slide you see one that is very important for this conference, especially by Marta Frederiks and Dorothea Nudge on methodological considerations, which has a panel tomorrow as well. So, well, had I been here with a proper booth, I'd have a lot more books and journals for you to show. So here is an example of that. And on the next slide, you see me and the associate editor Ingrid, in case you have any questions, questions or proposals for anything that we do. There will also be email message to all of you with some discounts and some more information. So that will arrive in your inbox. That will also have a discount code, which will be in the email. Thank you. I hope this was within time.
It was. Thank you, Tessel.
Okay.
Yesudas for Fortress Press.
Friends in Princeton and on the East Coast. Here in India, it's good night now. It's a great joy for me to be here with our friends from around the world at this conference. During the last few years, maybe about 4 years, Fortress Press has brought out about 40 titles. 40 titles on various aspects of world Christianity. And these books reflect a commitment on the part of Fortress Press to bring out creative theological reflection from the majority world to the West, and also the reflections happening elsewhere to the majority world. You know, we don't have time to discuss all the 40 books here, but we do have a short selection of books that will be shown now, and I will briefly talk about them. Could you show the, yes, thank you. This is Doing Theology with Humility, Generosity and Wonder, is by a well-known Sri Lankan theologian, Damayanti Nines, who's teaching at Eden Theological College. And she's talking mainly about the context of a pluralistic situation and doing theology in that context. Good, thank you. Unity as Prophetic Witness is first book in the Shapers of Ecumenical Theology series, and this is on Dr. Richard Hooft, who was the chief architect of the World Council Churches and the first general secretary. And the book is written by the well-known contemporary American theologian Michael Kinnaman. Michael Kinnaman's book. Thank you. Diaspora Christianity is by Sam George. It talks about the South Asian diaspora community around the world, more in North America, elsewhere, and the challenges and the complexities being faced by the South Asian Christians in the West. Thank you. This is a well-known name in the PTS community, Professor Charles C. West, who served the Princeton Seminary as a professor of or the professor of theology for almost 30 years. And before that, he was a missionary in China, also worked with the World Council of Churches, the National Council of Churches in USA, and Christian Peace Movement, the Bonhoeffer Society. This is the ecumenical memoir of Professor Charles West. This is also his last book that was published just before he passed on. Thank you. Migration and Public Discourse is part of the World Christianity and Public Religion series being edited by Professor Raimundo Barreto. And this is the second volume in that series, and we have the third one also here. And this book has been greatly supported by the Princeton Seminary community, and the professors from there also are involved in the publication of this series. Thank you. There were supposed to be a few more. Yeah, anyway, it's quite thank you for showing these images. And I would also like to say that if you would like to have more information on the programs of Fortress Press, you're welcome to contact me or Professor Raimundo Barreto, and we'll be happy to share the details. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yesudas. And to all of you, exciting things are happening in the publishing world, and these updates are helpful, and we appreciate the discounts. So we're now right on time, and we'll segue to the main event of the morning, the second keynote address, in just a moment. I think we'll wait until Shobana appears on screen.
Can you see me?
Yes, now.
Okay.
Bianco, can I proceed?
Yes, Dr.
All right. Greetings to all of you again out there in cyberspace, wherever you happen to be, across the many time zones of the global south and north. Welcome back to the second day of our virtual conference on world Christianity and its interactions with other religions. It is my privilege now to introduce our second keynote speaker, Dr. Shobana Shankar of Stony Brook University, a branch of the State University of New York on Long Island, where she teaches on the Faculty of History and Africana Studies. Dr. Shankar earned her doctorate at UCLA with a dissertation that signaled her subsequent academic trajectory, Children of the Mission in Kano Emirate, Conflicts of Conversion in Colonial Northern Nigeria, circa 1899 to 1953. Her research interests are wide-ranging, from African and Afro-Indian studies to health and medicine, but also, and perhaps especially, studies of inter-regional interactions, historical and contemporary, involving Christians, Muslims, and Hindus. She's going to give us a glimpse of that today in her keynote. Her first book, based on her UCLA doctoral dissertation, which I just mentioned, came out in 2014 from Ohio University Press under the title, Who Shall Enter Paradise? Christian Origins in Northern Nigeria, with a little different date range, 1890 to 1975. Other book-length projects are in the pipeline, including, for example, An Uneasy Embrace, Africa, India, and the Spectre of Race, which is coming out later this year. Along with our very own Afe Adogame, Dr. Shankar co-edited one of my all-time favorite essay collections, Religions on the Move, New Dynamics of Religious Expansion in a Globalizing World, which is published by Brill. The list goes on, and the items I just mentioned really don't do justice to her creativity and productivity. She's also a public commentator on the epidemiological travails of our times, and I recommend to everyone a recent digital essay called What the US Could Learn About Vaccination from Nigeria. Now, in just a moment, you'll see the link, I think, in the chat box. Well worth reading, very timely. Dr. Shankar's keynote is tantalizingly entitled A Missing Link, Unearthing Christianity's Resonance in the Rise of Indian Muslim and Hindu Missions in Africa, and would have been delivered, I think, a year ago, had it not been for the global health crisis. So thank you, Dr. Shankar, for giving us another shot, as it were. After her lecture, Dr. Shankar tells me that she would be happy to field comments and questions. For that purpose, you see the Q&A chat box. At any time, you could put in a comment or a question. We'll take them from there. Professor Shankar, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Young, for that generous introduction. And I want to thank everybody at Princeton Theological Seminary for inviting me to deliver this keynote to this distinguished group. The efforts of Professors Adogame, Barreto, and Young are invaluable, especially for bringing us together when we want so much to be sharing our work. This is a safe and good occasion for us, and I really appreciate it. I also want to extend my thanks to Amy Ellen and Byung-Ho Choi for doing my technology. Thank you very much. This year's theme is very close to my heart. I was a student in Nigeria during some of the country's most challenging years with religious tensions, and I was not a stranger to these tensions given my roots in India. So in my presentation today, you will find what I believe is a new perspective on how Africa and India are entangled, not only by comparison, but by religious networks and visions of how to make the world a better place. Africa is a major mission field where non-Africans and Africans have been active agents in religious transformations on the continent and far beyond on distant shores. Africans have played a vital part on their continent and as a global diaspora engaged in reverse missions. The dynamic story of world Christianity and the history of the global Christian missionary movement tell us this. But today, I want to look at the picture through a different lens, in which Christianity in Africa is entangled with indigenous African religions, Islam, and Hinduism. One of the largest, Byung-Ho, if you could please put up my PowerPoint. Thank you. One of the largest and most widespread modern Muslim organizations in the world, the Ahmadiyya Movement in Islam, would arguably not exist were it not for Protestant Christian missions. It would not have grown as a global ummah or community without vibrant branches in West Africa and the wider Black Atlantic. The Ahmadiyya sect was founded in 1889 in Punjab, British India, where the founder, Mirza Ghulam Ahmed, engaged in public and often hostile debates with Presbyterian missionaries. Christian missions were also a model for the Ahmadiyya founder. Within a few decades, the Punjabi sect had planted missions in many parts of the world. Their strong growth in West Africa was noteworthy because this region did not have a large Indian diaspora population. The Ahmadiyya was planted through the work of a relatively small number of Indian missionaries and indigenous African evangelists. Next slide, thank you. Here you see two images of that I'll be talking about. The missionary aspect of the Ahmadiyya in West Africa was so visible that the British colonial authorities in Gold Coast, then later Ghana, and Nigeria began to worry. The Secretary of the State for the Colonies in 1929 questioned the Ahmadi motives, believing that, quote, Mohammedans did not have organized missionaries. Another British officer explained to him that, quote, the Ahmadiyya is a modernist movement which endeavors to impart a more spiritual meaning to the more grossly materialistic tenets of Islam. The converts, he wrote, were mostly of, quote unquote, feeble intellect, and their missionaries, again, quote, mostly mild brown old gentlemen with white beards and green turbans wandering about. This dismissive claim could not anticipate that within a few decades, the Ahmadiyya movement would establish hundreds of schools and medical clinics, along with newspapers and printing presses that published books that were used in school curricula in independent Ghana, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, and the Gambia. Francophone West African Ahmadiyya converts also were growing in number. And you can see in this image that I will come back to, on the left-hand side, the first Indian missionary to West Africa, Ahmadi missionary, meeting Chief Oluwa of Lagos in 1921 in London. And on the right-hand side, you see Ghanaian Ahmadis who gathered in 1974 for a tour, who was consciously copying the tours of Billy Graham around the world and also to Africa. Quite remarkably, after India and Pakistan gained independence in 1947, the Ahmadiyya network became a conduit for more missionaries, Muslim missionaries of different sects, including the Tablighi Jamaat, and Hindu campaigns by the Ramakrishna Mission and others. The government of India followed the lead of the Ahmadiyya into West Africa because India needed a new relationship outside of Kenya, South Africa, and other parts of Africa where anti-Indian sentiments were strong. In what may come as a surprise to many, Hinduism has its African offshoots too in Ghana, Togo, and Nigeria. Next slide, please. Thank you. Swami Ghananda became the first initiated African Hindu monk in 1974, and Ugandan Buddhist Bhante Buddha Karita, the first African Buddhist monk, established a meditation center and temple in 2005. Here you can see on the left-hand side my own photograph of Swami Ghanananda's commemoration at the Hindu Monastery of Africa. On the left side after he died in 2017. And on the right side, you see an image of Bhante Buddha Rakita in Uganda, and from a story that was in The Guardian. If people are interested, I can send the link. All of these threads of Indian religious activities in Africa began with Christianity. From the desire of the Indian Ahmadiyya to challenge the hegemony of European Christian missions, to the initiation of African Christians into Hinduism and Buddhism. But competition is not the full picture. Afe Adegame and Jim Spickard write, Africa is not merely a passive recipient of global pressures. It is also a site of religious creativity that has had considerable effect on the outside world. The growth and global influence of the three religious heritages of sub-Saharan Africa, indigenous religions, Christianity, and Islam, needs to be understood against the backdrop of mutual influence and exchange at various historical epochs. West Africa was a specific landscape of exchange, creativity, synthesis, and popular devotion because of its Black Atlantic connections. In this, Ethiopia, stretching out her arms to her children to come home, made the place of religion in diasporic consciousness central. And as I'll talk about today, Indians were influenced by this. African religious thought had a profound power that Indians witnessed, wondered about, and began to absorb. So what I'm going to tell here is the impact of African religious worldview on India. And this story needs a conceptualization that goes beyond interaction, which is a word that I think most of us would acknowledge often does not capture fully the range of relationships forged in and consequences of cross-cultural encounters. For India and Africa, a relationship that has been unequal in terms of economic influence, interaction is too neutral a term. Heather Sharkey proposes the idea of unexpected consequences, drawing on an acknowledged concept in social sciences, biology, and public health, because this term, quote, draws attention away from the intent of the corporate agents. removes what sociologist Robert K. Merton called the purposive nature of action, and recognizes the multi-causal, chaotic, and sometimes elusive forces behind change. To recognize the African factor in shaping Indian religions requires this kind of challenge to expectations. The typical story is of the Indian diaspora in Africa and the limited contact of Africans and Indians in religious spheres, which is strange and curious to me. Are Hinduism and Buddhism not African? This is a question that becomes more apparent by the end of my talk, which unfolds as 3 acts of African Indian religious encounters. Thank you. For the next slide, Young Hope. I will trace how the Ahmadiyya Muslim movement began as a mission confrontation opposed to Christian missions, or rather what I call a corrective mission. From this, Hindus began to see through the Ahmadiyya experience in West Africa the idea of creating a Hindu outreach to Africans in the era of Indian-Pakistani competition and the desire of India to have more allies in West Africa, what we might call a post-colonial mission or post-colonial consciousness mission. But in the final act, as African Hinduism took root as an African initiative movement, the new turn in mission was critical reflection and higher consciousness, particularly on the question of why Indian Hindus had not conducted serious religious teaching and worship with Africans, even after long years of living on the African continent. To put it another way, Africans questioned why Hindus did not have missions, a truly remarkable consideration. I trace here the practice and the intellectual drive of missions transforming from cultural correction to a moral consciousness brought about through religious encounters. So the first act. Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, the Ahmadiyya founder, was a religious teacher who claimed to be a prophet and Messiah. He called himself the Mahdi and announced himself as the second coming of Jesus. From this beginning, the sect was embroiled in controversies. Orthodox Muslims consider Ahmad and his followers heretics, and there are many writings about the Ahmadiyya persecution around the world. As for European and American Christian missionaries who were active in the Punjab, they were outraged by Ahmad's claims about Jesus. Jesus' death and divinity were, of course, regular points of disagreement between Christians and Muslims, but Ahmad taught that Jesus did not die on the cross, but lived and traveled east to become a sage before his death in Kashmir, India. This was an idea that Hindus also embraced. As Simon Joseph writes, the idea that Jesus lived in India emerged within a European fascination with the mystic East and the ancient wisdom of India. Mirza Ghulam Ahmad therefore studied all 3 religions in his midst, but he focused on Christian texts and compiled a list of mistakes, in his view. As the Ahmadiyya sect developed a missionary agenda around 1900, it denounced Christian missions of the West for misleading colonized people, in particular about Christianity and Jesus in particular, Islam, vilifying Islam, he argued, and the history of the non-West, that is to say, for example, India's significance in the founding of Christianity. They developed a missiology of Islam as a modern, rational, and the most tolerant mode of living that befitted contemporary realities. Other teachings included jihad of the pen, not the sword, and prayer apart from Orthodox Muslims. In spite or perhaps because of these attacks, the Ahmadiyya had a tremendous impact as an Islamic missionary movement, especially where suspicion of Christian intentions and theological skepticism ran high. Ahmadis reached England, America, Mauritius, South Africa, but West Africa was unique because the sect was invited to come to West Africa by West Africans themselves around 1920 in Gold Coast, Ghana, and Nigeria. It is strange to call these leaders local as they were very cosmopolitan. Edward Blyden, the West Indian Liberian educationalist and religious teacher, was connected to Indians through the Muslim activism of the Liverpool Muslim Institute and the Woking Mosque. And of course, Blyden was an ordained reverend. Another main conduit was Nigerian-Brazilian Mohamed Lawal Basil Augusto, the founder of the Muslim Literary Society, which collected English language publications for literate Muslims and those quote-unquote unlettered Lagos Muslims in need of moral guidance. It is rumored that Augusto obtained Ahmadiyya literature from Dr. Oguntola Sapara, a Sierra Leonean Nigerian who began as a printer's apprentice. In exchange for his labor for British medical officers, Sapara was sent to London and Edinburgh for formal schooling in medicine and midwifery. Sapara met an Ahmadi leader, Khwaja Kamal-Uddin, at the Woking Mosque, probably initiating the first Lagosian contact with the Indian Ahmadiyya. Sapara was appointed the first African assistant colonial surgeon in Lagos and became a smallpox control expert engaging through religious practices. He went undercover in the Sapona cult to study how Yoruba priests, drew in fearful seekers and perhaps infected them to make them develop antibodies. The Orisha of smallpox, known by different names, including Sopona or Sakwata, was one of the most powerful in Afro-Brazilian religions, Yoruba religion, revered in Candomblé and as a Catholic saint, but always regarded as an African classical deity. Sapara, as a traveler, doctor, and one-time cult member, acted as a conduit of knowledge, bringing in Ahmadiyya publications to a unique circle of Lagosians. There was a strong indigenous Yoruba connection implied in the first West African outreach to the Ahmadiyya, so it was Muslim and Yoruba. Some were members of the Muslim Literary Society who, after reading literature from India, invited an Indian missionary to come to Lagos in 1916. An Indian Ahmadiyya missionary, Maulvi Abdul Rahman Nair, did not arrive in West Africa until 1921. Young Ho, the next slide, please. Once he did come, he got to work quickly. So this is the image you've seen, but this is the Indian missionary, Maulvi Abdul Rahim Nair. Once he came to West Africa, he got to work quickly, traveling across British West Africa to Freetown, Salt Pond in Ghana, Gold Coast, and Lagos. It was in Salt Pond that the Ekrafo Muslims heard from an Afro-Brazilian about the Ahmadiyya. Salt Pond became the major center of the Ahmadiyya in Ghana and continues to be today. The Ahmadis grew to the extent that the sect were the main petitioners to the British government to count Muslim populations in the census and to urge the independent Ghanaian Ministry of Education to include Arabic language and Islamic study courses at the public university. So the Ahmadis were deeply involved in intellectual study of religions in West Africa. The Ahmadiyya frightened Christian missionaries in India and in the United States who feared the interracial unity of Muslims threatened to make the Christian West irrelevant. In Africa, the Ahmadi schools treated Christian teaching as a form of violence against Islam and poisonous propaganda. Ahmadi missions from west to east in Sierra Leone, Gold Coast, Nigeria, and East Africa, which they considered less importance to them, operated independent newspapers and other media. In Nigeria, an Ahmadi printing press made books for use in government schools, and in Ghana, the Ahmadis started the first formal Arabic language school. The content aimed to correct Christian miseducation, which had also been Edward Biden's mission. Miseducation about Islam, the West's superiority, Jesus' fate on the cross, and his death in India, and increasingly pre-colonial African history, notably Islamic history. The malleability of the Christian Bible in non-Christian Indian hands also appealed to indigenous, local, and vernacular understanding. The involvement in Indian Muslim missionaries in African educational curricula also is an unknown hand in the nationalist history writing of early post-colonial West Africa. The Ahmadiyya's extensive print cultural economy connected West Africa and India to where Ahmadi missions sent news of Africa to Indians. Lahore was a center of Muslim media and Christian media, for that matter, and the newspaper Muslim Outlook connected Ahmadiyya missions in London and Cape Town, South Africa. By the mid-1920s, Ahmadi reporters were clearly trying to educate and tie Muslim Indians to other Muslims and Black peoples everywhere. American slavery became a common theme in the Muslim Outlook newspapers in the 20s. One article titled "Islamic Culture, Causes of Its Rise and Decline" was written by a reformer who claimed there was no analogy in the Islamic world to slavery on American plantations. Another article reported on Black politics and the Ethiopianist return to Africa movement of Marcus Garvey. The author summarized the position of Garvey in this way: there could never be a reconciliation between the Negroes and the whites, according to this school, which had got a large following in Africa. So the Ahmadis were also educating Indians about Africa, because at this time one can imagine that their interconnections were limited and filtered through British sources. In 1927, an Ahmadi author, wrote a lengthy piece titled Brotherhood of Man in the Muslim Outlook, making reference to African slaves in India as evidence of the principle of equality embedded in the foundation of Islam. This is his lengthy quote, or part of the quote. There is gainsaying the fact that the majority of Muslims in India are those recruited from the original inhabitants of the country, the pariahs and untouchables. But yet, as soon as these people embraced Islam, they were admitted into the society with the same fairness and magnanimity as if they were Sayyid for generations. Malik Kafur, who, as history tells us, fell in love with a blue-eyed, fair-complexioned princess of the imperial harem, hailed from the rank of low-class Hindus. The general, who commanded the Pathan army during the days of Sultana Razia, was no other than a black Abyssinian. In India, we find a dynasty known by the proud title of slave dynasty came as they were from the status of slaves. In short, as we proceed through the pages of Islamic history, the same example of equality and it is indeed a unique feature of Islam, and we challenge the followers of other persuasions and creeds to show a better example, or at least a like of it, from their history and from their sacred literature. The salvation of the depressed classes lies in Islam and Islam alone. Ahmadi suggests African ancestry of some Indian Muslims, which is true, borne out in other history, and also claims kinship between low-caste Indians and African slaves. Was this fictive or real? It is not clear. The themes of interracial brotherhood and even romance were aimed at the Hindu caste system, but also the urgent contemporary problems of conversion campaigns underway in Lahore and other parts of India by the Hindu Arya Samaj organization. The themes were radical for the time, when the segregation of the Indian diaspora in East Africa was also beginning to irritate Africans. By contrast, the Ahmadiyya curriculum on Africa drew attention to African-Indian intimacy and the race-caste problem. Ahmadiyya print proselytism shows Pan-Africanism intermingling with Pan-Islamism, Ethiopianism with Islam. Drawing attention to Africans in India connected the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean worlds. Racial nationalism appealed to the plight of Muslims, low-caste and untouchable peoples, and the darker-skinned, by implication those who did not have Aryan roots, which by this time were celebrated by high-caste Hindu nationalists. Ahmadis and perhaps other Indian Muslims began addressing Indian political questions through a racial prism. Ahmadiyya opened up new optimism for racial equality, gender reforms, and girls' schooling and pacifism. I cannot talk in this time about the girls' schools in West Africa, but they were very important. This was a new opening between Africans and Indians, specifically in the religious field, before political connections were unified, even more important, or I would argue more important than Gandhi's activism up to 1914 in South Africa, which he did not apply to Black South Africans. Gandhi excluded Blacks and low-caste Indians at that time from his activism. The Ahmadiyya anti-Christian Muslim mission was a corrective mission. In the second act, I will discuss post-colonial consciousness and how it took a new direction from this interwoven mission. The second act, independence. After 1947, India and Pakistan wanted to establish new relationships with Africans, who had largely yet to gain independence from European colonialists. In the midst of struggles for self-rule, anti-Indian riots erupted in Durban, South Africa in 1949, leading to the loss of many lives, rape, and destruction of Indian property. The Mau Mau rebellion in Kenya made Indian settlers choose sides, either supporting African self-determination, which many thought was against Indians, or siding with the British imperialists. In the midst of all this, political aspirants created a movement for Afro-Asian solidarity on the global stage. The role of the new Indian government in challenging South African apartheid at the United Nations from 1946 was an early public salvo. And in 1955, the Afro-Asian Conference in Bandung followed with a cohering political platform. 29 African and Asian countries met in Indonesia and issued a 10-point communique that, along with non-alignment, was to help navigate the global South, or the majority world, through the Cold War and other post-colonial problems. Little would anyone expect that India and Pakistan wanted to use the Ahmadiyya mission as an entree into the grassroots in West Africa, so to go beyond high-level meetings. The Indian press attaché, who first toured Nigeria and Gold Coast for his government in 1955, recognized the importance of the Muslim missionaries when he met Nasim Saifi, an Ahmadiyya missionary who had been in Nigeria since 1945, since before partition. Saifi proved to be useful for the press attaché Mahesh Jugran to refute the perception of Africans of Hindu discrimination of Muslims, Christians, Dalits, the so-called untouchables, and all but the highest castes. To Africans, many Africans, India did not represent tolerance after partition. Thus, the attaché Jugran described the following scene. I am sure the Nigerians never expected me to embrace the head of the Ahmadiyya movement in Nigeria, Mr. Nasim Saifi, when he was introduced to me as a Pakistani. Fortunately for me, this man too did not indicate anything which would have given a hint to strangers that we were a separate people. Separate people within 10 years. As an Ahmadiyya missionary, he displayed the same patriotism, the same unity of India, irrespective of its religions, as was expected from any citizen bred and brought up in a secular country. I felt proud of this man and deliberately spent most of my time with him just to indicate to the Africans that this question of Muslims in India was a bogey started by the British in India. Byung Ho, my next slide, please. Thank you. Saifi was a devout Muslim and a modernist. In 1947, he began regular radio broadcasts via the Nigerian Broadcasting Corporation, focusing specifically on the affairs of Muslims. He helped spearhead the first English-language Muslim weekly newspaper, The Truth, published out of Lagos starting in 1951. His work kept him in close contact with Muslim Nigerian intellectuals and political leaders, and non-Muslims like Nnamdi Azikiwe and Chief Obafemi Awolowo. Both had careers as journalists. Saifi joined Nigerian delegations, meeting honored guests from Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie to American boxing champion and civil rights activist Muhammad Ali, who visited Nigeria in 1964. Here you see Saifi presenting Muhammad Ali a Quran. Saifi identified as a Pakistani very clearly, and as his publication of the book In Defense of Pakistan showed, Saifi, with his connection to the literary world of West Africa, had commanded enormous influence in Nigeria. And with Hindus having little idea of religious missions to non-Hindus or to non-Indians, the success of the Muslim missionaries could help India shape a pluralist outreach promising goodwill to all religions. Sarva Dharma Sambhava. This was no natural outgrowth of Hinduism, I would argue, but instead a carefully constructed practice that for Africa was an important root of it was formed in Africa, this universalist vision. In opening formal relations with West Africa, Indian authorities learned they needed to tread carefully in religious politics, and besides presenting India as a tolerant and plural nation, also had to consider African complexity. An idea arose to send itinerant Hindu swamis or gurus to give lectures in Ghana, the first Black African nation, and other territories. One Swami Nisrayasananda of the Neo-Hindu Vedanta Society spent nearly 4 months traveling around the African continent and reported on the high interest in spiritual matters in West Africa, and the challenges in Kenya where the Mau Mau emergency had exacerbated tensions between Africans and Indians, and seemed to offer little hope for cross-cultural dialogue. The Swami had met Muslim Ahmadis in both Kenya and Gold Coast, and based on these meetings recommended strongly that in Gold Coast and Nigeria, Indians should establish a center that was, quote, completely multi-religious and multiracial, in which the people gathering for philosophic and religious discussions would have the opportunity of forming their own views. Swami Nisrayasananda's visit suggested a way for Hindu missions to present themselves as non-proselytizing and universalist. This idea was challenged within India among secularist nationalists who felt India should focus on economic relations with Africans. India should not become a cultural neo-colonialist or neo-imperialist, which was, after all, a fear very much alive in decolonizing nations, or in the decolonizing world. Yet others, like Sri Appa Pant, one of the Indian Prime Minister Nehru's closest advisors and who worked in East Africa for a very long time, understood the message Africans were sending Indians. He refused the false choice between indigenous or Western, and through his many years in interactions with Africans, saw a third way. And this is how he put it. Was there a third alternative? Could one envisage a synthesis of all that was vital, satisfying, beautiful, and energizing from all the cults and cultures, backgrounds and histories, African, Indian, Islamic, and Christian? It was a dream of some of us that a new identity, a new personality should be developed, more mature, more versatile, a new man for the modern age, with the potential of a world citizen. This third way was a religious non-alignment, like political non-alignment of the Cold War. This was the influence of Africans and Indian Pakistani missionaries that prefigured post-colonial politics. Indian and African spiritualism were being co-constructed to differentiate the emerging global South from the secular West in national and transnational cultural But I argue that Indians would not have articulated this kind of vision were it not for African interlocutors, Africans asking questions about India's own political and situation and social oppression and religious oppression. The third act in my story can be seen as a critical distancing and reflection of Africans back to Indians, to change Indians in yet a different way. So now I'll move to the third act. Hinduism held a fascination for some Africans, like Kwesi Essel. Essel was born in 1937 in Senya Baraku in what is today the central region of Ghana. His family members occupied important positions as healers and ritual specialists. His father was an herbalist and his mother a traditional princess and a priestess. She was the more powerful one, he remembered, as the spirit world would possess her and she would tell the people what they wanted to know. She served as a priestess to the chief of Senya Baraku until her death in 1945. Kwesi then began to work with his father as an herbalist, but longed to better understand his mother's spiritual trances, which he tried to achieve through prayer. He also tried to achieve through fasting and prayer at Christian churches. But meditation eventually led him to a man who he described as a traveler from Ghana to India and Burma, and who told Kwesi he might be able to access more Hindu esoteric objects if he could get in contact with Indians in India. Next slide, please. Thank you. Kwesi began collecting whatever Indian talismans and pictures he could find, which he said were available and fairly sought after in Ghana. Wanting more, he later told biographers he wrote to someone in India and began receiving pamphlets that were written in unknown languages, but had pictures of goddesses and gods to which he was immediately drawn. They reminded him of his mother, he noted, and also Mame or Mamiwata, in whom his father believed. Taking what appears to be a new direction in Mamiwata practices along the Atlantic coast, Kwesi began to fast because it helped him reach the spiritual state. So Mamiwata has a very important history in Western Africa, but also as far east as Congo and Tanzania, and far into the Western Atlantic, into the Black Atlantic, as a water deity who is often depicted as a mermaid or depicted as a snake, as you see here. And these images are also found in Togolese Vodun paintings, or artists even who are different religions, as Muslim or Christian, who paint Mamiwata. Kwesi started a prayer camp and with the support of his followers traveled to India to study at an ashram on the Ganges River in 1969, the Divine Life Society in Rishikesh. After he returned to Ghana, an Indian guru traveling through Ghana, Swami Krishnananda in 1975 came to visit Ghana to visit the Indian diaspora. But the Indian diaspora told him about a Ghanaian who had studied in India and who had profound powers, religious powers. And then Swami Krishnananda met Kwesi Essel. So Kwesi Essel had developed a following of African and Indian disciples by leading prayers in Sanskrit and leading meditation and also communal singing of bhajans. So this led Swami Krishnananda to initiate Kwesi as the first African Hindu monk and rename him Swami Ghananda. And Swami Ghananda became the leader of the Hindu monastery of Africa in Greater Accra. 5 more branches of the Hindu monastery grew in time in Togo and Ghana. There were other branches of Hinduism among West Africa. The International Society for Krishna Consciousness was another one. And the practice of meditation, vegetarianism, and asceticism grew among Ghanaian, Nigerian, Togolese university faculty, students, women professionals, and others. Many Indians came also to consult Swami Ghananda to seek his blessings because he was renowned for his wisdom. Next slide, please. Thank you. But the Swami was also unique for how he used his moral authority. In the magazine Hinduism Today, which was published in Hawaii at a white American founded Hindu ashram, a white American Swami founded Satguru's Hindu ashram, Hinduism Today is a vehicle for the worldwide Indian diaspora, but also the Hindu diaspora. And in it, in 1998, there was featured a story that Swami Ghananda wrote, or at least part of it, titled "Africa is Ripe for a Strong Hindu Future." And in it, Swami Ghananda contrasted the short history of Hinduism on the African continent with the old, strong roots of Islam and Christianity. And you can see here this quote, many quotes from his text, which I want to focus on several elements. While Christianity and Islam were expanding and getting the main hold on the African continent, the few Indians who arrived were merchants and workers interested purely in their business, not in portraying Hindu lifestyle. Today, very few Indians in Africa live by Hindu tenets. Because Christianity and Islam earlier gained such strong roots in Africa, Hinduism has hitherto had little or no impact. The Indian community mixes little with other Africans. They tend to be inward-looking and share only with Indians rather than sharing the best things about Hinduism with Africans. As a result, Hinduism has a very low profile in Africa today. African religions and Hinduism have certain similarities. Traditional African religions recognize the many aspects of Brahman and worship God as Prithvi, Vayu, Varuna, Agni, etc., just as in Hinduism. Only Africans who have been exposed to Hinduism can appreciate these similarities, which help them to better understand African beliefs and aspirations. In Africa, Christians and Muslims alike who want self-development and self-realization turn to Hinduism. Hinduism, alongside other religions, must help in harmonizing the efforts of all religions to foster the needed peace for both material and spiritual development of the continent. My advice to Hindus worldwide is that the Satguru, the leader of the Hawaiian monastery, will lead you through no darker rooms than he himself went through before, for he that comes into God's kingdom must enter by this door. Beyond what he said here, the Swami said very little about African Hindus, whom he described as a few people who practice Hinduism under the cloak of secret societies. But his challenge is bold in so many ways. He challenged Christians and Muslims, but especially Hindus, on the universalism of their religions, but also on how they saw indigenous African religions. Reverend Abamfo Atiamo and Albert Waku have described how African Hindus, like Swami Ghananda, reject Pentecostalisation and its attempts to erase indigenous cultural forms. But the Swami's challenge to the Indian Hindu diaspora is remarkable for probing about cultural exclusion and not cultural imperialism. This historicist and philosophical critique of Hinduism from within is a vital expression of African cosmology, which I argue is inseparable from the cumulative and collective consciousness of religious missions, Christian, Muslim, and Hindu, religious missions specifically as forms of interaction, exchange, and sharing. So in my conclusion, I want to reflect on the three acts of the story by returning to what Africa means in world Christianity and its religious interactions. Next slide, please. Young-ho, thank you. India, through the life of Mahatma Gandhi, has held itself as the soul of the world, the origin of universalism, of multi-religiosity. But I would argue that Africa is the world's conscience, and Africa has been India's conscience. But when violence interrupted in India and Pakistan, with violence in 1947, but later, and also with violence directed at African migrants in India in many episodes since 2014, and of course violence between Hindus and Muslims, Hindus towards Christians, and the violence directed towards marginalized castes and women, Africans have acted as a conscience to challenge India on in its sense of itself as the soul of the world. I do or blame or ascribe blame to others in a reductive way. Rather, we need to be precise and persistent in examining evolving relationships in religious spheres on the ground and in lived experiences. In the interrelationship of South Asians and Africans, we see how religious interactions in the global South hold possibilities for peace that are often overshadowed by Western models of reconciliation. And so what I mean here is that within the story I've been telling, from corrective missions to critical reflective missions, there is a possibility for peacemaking, alternative, non-secular, interreligious strategies for peacemaking. Like Christianity, reconciliation has many faces that are not readily seen unless we use methods that decenter orthodoxies and look beyond origins to creativity and constructivism. So I have not focused today, for example, on how Africans practice Hinduism, because I'm less interested in Hindu orthodoxies, and in fact, creativity, constructivism, and critical consciousness. The story I have told reveals just some of the unexpected consequences of missions that continue to reverberate in the relationships between peoples who are not considered the originators of missions, but have today become the future of missions. As Professor Walls told us yesterday, such encounters outside the West or outside the Mediterranean world or the Levant would not in earlier times have interested people. We now know how important they are to our understanding of world Christianity. And I would argue world Christianity is vital to understanding many facets of our world more broadly, as I've tried to relay today. Facets such as race and racial understanding and racial tension, but also futurism and how we articulate a better future for all of us, for humanity. And so to return to my title and to conclude, the missing link in studying religious interactions, I would argue, and the missing link in this story is the moral urgency of understanding our future, that people who are of different faiths come together that brings people of different religions together. That is the moral urgency to chart a better future. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Shankar. Really fascinating. Ladies and gentlemen of the audience, the Q&A chat box is now open, and we'd like to see what you would like to engage Professor Shankar about. There's so much. While you are submitting your comments and questions, allow me just a moment to say, kind of as an expression of thanks, that, you have helped us, I think, get beyond thinking of world Christianity and its cross-cultural diffusion in isolation from the cross-cultural diffusion of certain other religions. And I'm afraid that what we often do is to put on blinders and look only at what's happening within Christian circles, so to speak. At most, we may bring in Islam because we know that Islam is diffusing cross-culturally in a remarkable way as well. But we rarely ever bring in forms of Islam like the Ahmadiyya movement. We almost never think about Hinduism or Buddhism as religions that do the same thing, that diffuse across cultural boundaries from South Asia to Africa and in fact all around the world. So this is, I think, a very helpful thing. You're helping us to recover from a certain kind of isolation that we unfortunately labor under doing our scholarship on world Christianity. I very much appreciate that. So let's see what
Thank you.
people are submitting. Yeah.
I just wanted to also just simply, make a statement, but maybe people will challenge it or fill it in or agree with me. Oftentimes there is this very simplistic connection made that Christian missions have influenced Muslim missions, right? That Muslim missions have now started to appropriate or copy or become like Christian missions. I believe that we need to have a closer look at how those kinds of global movements have intersected and co-constructed each other.
Good, co-construction. It's actually a crowded field with lots of competition for the adherence of large populations of people who have many choices to choose from. Until there is a question in the chat box, I'm going to put one to you of a more specific kind that relates to the first part of your talk today, and that has to do with the reception and perception of the Ahmadiyya movement in Africa. Other Muslims, whether Sunni, Shia, or of another persuasion, what was their response to the Ahmadiyyas coming into Africa?
That's a very good question. There was a lot of organizing. I mean, one of the within African societies, like in South Africa, African Muslim societies in Nigeria, also particularly in Nigeria and South Africa, there was a strong collective organization following the Ahmadiyya's appearance to create their own schools and teach their own interpretations of Islam, because they didn't want this to be the dominant form of Islam in the public consciousness. And so, and also missionary organizations like the Tablighi Jamaat also began to really start seeing African, missions to Africa as very important. And I also have uncovered recently that Ghanaian Muslim who became very anti-Ahmadi and studied in Pakistan and studied in Saudi Arabia and became a missionary in Trinidad himself. So we can even look at if it's not a reverse mission, a different kind of direction of African Muslim missionaries going to other parts of the world, either to counter Ahmadiyya influence or just inspired to do their own kind of evangelism. And I think another example that I didn't mention is Indonesia, where non-Ahmadi Muslims also became very I guess the word is provoked. I mean, the Ahmadiyyas have provoked a lot of reaction to them in different corners of the world. I'm seeing seeing many questions now. Yes, I think the first one might have come in the chat from Shalan Park. Punya Bhumi, or particular sacred geography in the come up in the creative universalizing discourse of Swami Ghananda. What's very interesting is what he did was actually, what I argue is Swami Ghananda made expanded the sacred geography of Hinduism by making Ghana a Hindu part of the sacred landscape, in that his being a guru and his being a religious expert, and Indians started coming to him from not only Ghana but other parts of Africa where Indians were, to see this guru and to be darshan, to have the experience of seeing with him. And so sacred geography is there tied to India, but what's very fascinating in what Ghanaian Hindus say is that Africa and India were geographically ancient, prehistorically. There are these ideas about race that I think are that should not be dismissed as sort of a fantastical or fabulated notion, but actually come in a sacred geography of human origins being found in a geography that is not beholden to Western or to scientific geography. So in other words, the sacred geography is more important and even helps explain in a very material way the racial similitude of Indians and Africans in some interpretations of racial origins of Indians and Africans. And you can find this in Afrocentrism too, as a secular, like Sheikh Anta, secular kind of Afrocentrism. But Swami Ghananda had a Hindu Afrocentrism, I suppose you could call it, or a Hindu Black centrism. Not only Africa centric, if that helps explain how he saw sacred geography. From David Lindenfeld, should I read the questions out loud?
Sure, that's a good idea. Now we have more than we can possibly handle, and they're really good ones.
I have a long history of reaching out to Islam via the translator and slave trade. Did this relationship have any influence on the more modern embrace that you address? The Ahmadiyya came via the coast, so they were really seen in the coastal Muslim populations, so the Yoruba, the Fante. So the Hausa were often resistant to the trans-Saharan trading Muslims were resistant to some of the Ahmadis. But some interesting factors are that the Ahmadiyya are seen, for example, in the north of Nigeria, to be supportive to Muslim minorities like the Shia. And so these smaller sects, or sects that are less popular, but less dominant in Islamic Africa, African Muslim sects, so Shia, for example, have a camaraderie with the Ahmadis. But the other interesting thing is that in Ghana, for example, the Ahmadis are known to be less, they keep the indigenous names. They'll keep a indigenous Afante name with an Islamic name, whereas Hausa Islam in the north of Ghana, or Dagamba Islam, is considered more orthodox. So the Ahmadis are definitely reshaping the universal orthodoxy in West Africa itself. So who are considered orthodox and who are heterodox, and this is actually one of the interesting things, is that the Ahmadis have may in some way unexpected consequences brought about a stronger reformist tendency among Muslims. Okay, the next question from Afe, if you have any thoughts about the impact of the Ahmadiyya on NASFAT. Well, I think the Ahmadiyya are very tied to this constellation of neo-Islamic movements that emerged in southern Nigeria, in different parts of Nigeria, but also tied very much to a modernist sensibility. The question of Islam being a modern religion. And so I do think there's a relationship with NASFAT that I have not studied closely, but I think the key may be even to look at universities and the conversion or the consciousness of university students and professors. Many of the Ahmadiyya came to West Africa as university professors too. They weren't necessarily just identified as missionaries. And so I think these youth movements have youth movements have a tie to African-Indian relations that were emerging at universities as well. And I think Afe could, echo what I'm saying, that many of the Indian and Pakistani diaspora in West Africa were in universities. Hinduism in a shroud of secrecy. Were Hindus and Ahmadiyya followers persecuted in West Africa? I think this is a very important question that Reverend Atiemo argues that Pentecostals and reformists, very reform-minded Muslims in Ghana do not approve of Ghanaian Hinduism. But on the other hand, and thus persecute Ghanaian Hindus. But on the other hand, the Hindu monastery is a place where there are people of all religions coming for specific practices, so that the Hinduism is divorced from orthodoxy, for example, and meditative, or a certain bodily discipline of silence or fasting, or doing or singing. Singing is people come to sing bhajans at the monastery, even if they don't know the language, Sanskrit or Hindi or other languages. I've also talked about it in an article how Hindus of different castes and from different parts of the country of India now are coming to the monastery because they feel freer to practice their form of Hinduism in this monastery. So it's almost a refuge for Hindus who face caste oppression or face other kinds of oppression in India, which is a fascinating development, that an African Hindu space becomes a refuge for Hindus, Indian Hindus. So I think it's almost the zone of the Hindus, Ghanaian, the same kind of oppression that might exist between Muslims and Christians does not exist towards Ghanaian Hindus. The Ahmadiyya have been persecuted, but again, the Ahmadiyya persecution against the Ahmadiyya has been much worse in South Asia than it's been in Africa. And I think this goes back to the larger argument that there's a culture, I don't want to overstate it, but a culture of tolerance of religious difference in African societies that does not exist in South Asian societies. Contemporary religious movements you see in West Africa. Chinese and Latin American missionaries. I've known many Korean Christian missionaries in Nigeria. I've also know there is a Japanese-inspired Buddhist movement in Congo that Peter Lamberts has written about that was brought via Brazil. So I've also traced a pan-African indigenous religious cultures. So whether it's Mamiwata or other in African American spiritualist practices that are non-conformist, I would say, have come from the United States, practitioners of these religions have come from the United States or come from the Caribbean to Africa, to West Africa, to Ghana, and in particular, where they might meet, for example, at the Hindu monastery of Ghana, but because it's a space of non-conforming religious practitioners to come and meet. So definitely there's Brazilian activities, I've not seen, well, I mentioned the Buddhist, Ugandan Buddhist, and the person in the picture with him is a Thai follower or a Thai disciple who came to the Ugandan monastery. So there's definitely more of these, the sacred geography. Africa itself has a sacred geography in that it is seen as a haven for religious seekers around the world, and I think we're going to see more of that. Moses asked me if there was a trade business interest between the Ahmadis and the Ghanaians. Only after, this was the fascinating part, only after the Ahmadis were invited for purely religious discussions, did the Ahmadis begin publishing or printing books. I have not seen other kinds of trade that they were engaged in. It was predominantly this intellectual trade, writing books or petitioning to the government to use their literature in government curricula. So there is, I really believe there are some African Indian religious encounters that started in religion and maybe have never developed that economic interest, in part because that economic interest is what became so tense in other parts of the continent. It was the Indian businessmen who became the focus of Kenyan resistance, or South African in Durban there were riots. It was the Indian business owners that really became the lightning rod. And I think that there were Indians and Pakistanis who consciously realized the critique of materialism was one that had a basis in reality. Yes, and what is the significance of so many cult leaders in Nollywood movies being Indian? Well, in Nigeria, there is a association of Indians with magic. And so I think Nollywood gives expression to the fears and fascination with magic in a very significant way. It's very dramatic and it drives many plots, and it's interesting. And the Indian is a familiar magic figure for Nigerians. And there are stories that people tell about, Indians couldn't play football, but then they won this one football game using magic by football, not American football, soccer, by 100-0 because of the ability to control magic. So this has also been a reason why non-Ahmadi Muslims don't like the Ahmadiyya and see them as dabbling as kind of mystical in a negative way. Deanna asks, could I speak more about the influence I see of Ahmadis have had on non-Muslim understandings of Islam generally or in a particular place? I think this is a really important question because, for example, if you take the Ahmadi position on jihad, for example, and there are many writings about jihad and the interpretation that jihad should be the sword of a battle of the pen instead of the sword. I think that in some communities, like in southern Ghana or in southern Nigeria, non-Muslim understanding of the Ahmadis is that they are a more modernist and pacifist form of Islam. And so, for example, in Yoruba families may have Muslims, Christians, and practitioners of Yoruba religion all in one family, and there's a long tradition of coexistence. The popularity of Ahmadiyya Islam among the Yoruba, I think, relates exactly to this point, is that version of Islam has been fits the worldview, the Yoruba worldview. I think it's also the reason why, for example, in Nigeria, the government would adopt Ahmadi texts for the Islamic religious studies curriculum, the religious IRK curriculum. Now, of course, this generates conflict with non-Ahmadi Muslims, or Orthodox Muslims as they're called. But I think non-Muslims saw a positive benefit to taking this minority sect as the representative of Islam for multi-religious society in curriculum and other understanding. Okay, so do I think the Ahmadiyya missionaries found in parts of Africa an unusual receptivity to the idea of a coming Messiah? Well, I really do think there is I've talked about the importance, up to the present currents of messianism in African societies that have, and prophecy that have been there. We can see it in Buddhism, we can see it in millennialism, and I've talked about this in terms of the specific missions that were able to garner converts among Muslims in northern Nigeria because they preached about the coming. I mean, that was a specific part of their preaching, and I think that the Ahmadiyya tapped into very much into this imminence, and I think that is exactly sort of what reformist Muslims don't like about this form of Islam, but also why the writings of the Ahmadis or their preaching might attract Christians. Because the way, for example, that they use the Bible was appealing to the sensibility about the coming Messiah. And so I think this is why, for example, the Ahmadis have moved into Francophone West Africa. So now Burkina and Ivory Coast have large Ahmadi minorities, or Benin, for example. So Emma's question okay, thank you.
We do need to stop at 11:30.
Yes, and I'm just engagement because it's happening. But could you please develop your theme of peaceful interrelationships, or the contemporaries of co-creation of positive relations that come directly from examples that you speak of? Peaceful interrelationships. Well, I think one of them is face-to-face preaching, where people engage each other and have these dialogues and debates that Professor Walls has written about for the 19th century in Crowther's time, that I think that you see the Ahmadis doing. I think it's very important because the mediated speech by loudspeakers or by television or by newspapers and becomes very disembodied. And I think the human contact is extremely important. And I think it's a very regular feature of, in my perspective, how early missions develop into more mature missions. This is something that's very central still to the ability for missions to continue to evolve, but not become extinct. Okay, so I will move to consider Gandhi's exclusion. Would I consider Gandhi's exclusion of blacks and lower castes and his activism as having an effect on the perception and base of Hinduism in Africa? Absolutely, and I really do believe, and my book talks a lot about this. I really do believe that the disinterest or even the anger towards Indians in some quarters and the Indian government in some quarters stems from the fact that that Gandhi becomes a symbol for India. And people in India have people from different religions, people from all kinds of castes who have been oppressed, have argued, why does Gandhi continue to have to be the symbolism for India? Why can't Ambedkar or someone else be a symbol for India? So if the Indian government is giving a statue at the University of Ghana in Legon, which recently, why give Gandhi? In fact, the Ghanaians said, we would like a statue of Ambedkar, but would India allow Ambedkar, the leader of the so-called untouchables who promoted conversion to Buddhism, would India allow Ambedkar to be its symbol? Okay, so Willie Mafuta says, I grew up in the Congo and the representation of Mami Wata is half human and half fish. Could you comment on that configuration, how that variation has come to be as opposed to the snake representation? In West African Vodou, there is the representation of the snake, which I think represents the danger, but also the mysticism that I have talked about associated with Indians. I think also because Mami Wata is now Christian, Hindu, Muslim, and as the Mami Wata, the snake represents also the danger of, in the Bible. And so I think the mixed message, the religious interactions have produced new iconography, but have not changed certain things about Mami Wata, for example, her being a woman, her being a water deity, beautiful, dangerous, but also and wealthy, and promising wealth and security. So I will stop there because I know we have a hard stop. And thank you everybody for this wonderful opportunity.
We're just getting warmed up, and the questions have all been good ones, and I marvel at the fluency of your responses. I was going to myself, if we had time, ask about the incident on the campus at the University of Ghana, the defacement of the Gandhi statue, but you got it in. So we've covered a lot of ground, and I think this has been a 90-minute keynote segment well spent. Thank you so much. Your mastery of this complex field of research is really impressive, and we're so glad that you came to share it with us.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I think we should express our appreciation to Professor Shankar. If you can, wave a hand or send her a message that says how much you appreciated today. We'll have to leave it there because we have only a short intermission before the next round of panels begins.